It's a doctrine which has compromised our free speech and left our society increasingly fragmented, indeed segregated along parallel lines, and troubled, I would say now, to the point of collapse.
To close the case for side proposition, I look to Peter Whittle.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here. It is an honor and a privilege. It's my very first time. The motion before us, as we now know, is that this House believes that multiculturalism has no future in the UK. Well, it does indeed have no future in the UK, but also it shouldn't have a future. We should not seek, I believe, to keep alive a doctrine which I believe has done nothing but harm to this country. An ideology which has been imposed largely from above, which has relied on lies, distortions, and cover-ups to keep it in place. It's a doctrine which has compromised our free speech and left our society increasingly fragmented, indeed segregated along parallel lines, and troubled, I would say now, to the point of collapse. Multiculturalists have always talked about building a community of communities. Now, a community of communities might be many things, but what it is not is one nation, and certainly not a united nation. They've also always preached that cultures were of equal value and that they should be celebrated and respected as such. The political, media, and cultural elites have enforced a narrative based on this, which I believe sprung in part from their basic cultural self-loathing and their distaste for the very concept of the nation or nationhood, and the British nation in particular. Celebrating British culture was never ever part of the plan. Indeed, it was antipathetic to the multiculturalists' agenda. Diversity is our greatest strength, is multiculturalism's mantra. You deny that at your peril. But I'm sure you must be familiar with the work of Robert Putnam, hardly some right-wing headbanger. He is a left-leaning sociologist in America, wrote a brilliant thesis called Bowling Alone. And he found that the greater the amount of diversity in a society, then the lessening of social capital there was and the decline in trust, not just between groups, but actually within groups too. I would say that that is really the situation that we are facing now. We have gone from what was an extraordinarily high-trust society to a low-trust society, and that's happened within one generation. So what really has it meant when I refer to this doctrine being imposed from above and allowing almost no criticism? Well, we need look no further than the appalling news which we have been discussing over the past few weeks. The nationwide systematic rape, torture, and abuse of thousands upon thousands of white working-class girls by mainly Pakistani Muslim gangs. Not yet, has blown apart the pieties and the dogmas of multiculturalism in Britain. Now, thanks to the interventions of Elon Musk, the world now knows of what must be this country's biggest racially aggravated sexual crime. No, not yet. These girls were chosen because they were white by men who consider them to be subhuman. Now, from the police to the social services, from Parliament to the media, these shocking crimes were covered up largely to keep the multicultural narrative in place. As one former Labour MP put it a few years ago, there was the feeling that we shouldn't rock the multicultural boat. Another Labour MP more crudely agreed with the statement a few years back that the victims should, quote, shut up for the sake of diversity. Now, the enormity of the rape gangs issue is such that I believe it will force a complete reassessment of recent British history. The need to enforce this official narrative that multiculturalism and unfettered mass immigration are wholly beneficial to this society has shaped our public policy and our politics for the whole of this century so far. And in doing so, it has transformed our physical, cultural, and political landscape. What we are left with now is a situation, I believe, which calls into question the very legitimacy of our democracy and indeed of the British state. In reality, cultural practices and some beliefs that are totally at odds with our society have been tolerated for too long or indeed ignored. Now, just to take one example, my organization, the New Culture Forum, about 10 years ago did a report into FGM, female genital mutilation. This is, I hope you would agree, a barbaric practice. We established that tens of thousands of young girls in the UK were at risk or indeed had suffered this disgusting form of what is child abuse. I'm sure that number is even greater now. Now, FGM was specifically made a crime back in the 1980s. So how many convictions have there been? 2. Just 2 in 40 years. As with the cover-up of the rape gangs, the only conclusion to be drawn is that the only conclusion to be drawn is that this disgusting practice went unpunished so as not to upset the narrative that was in place. And also, of course, out of a fear of a career-ending racism. That fear of being called racist has been a powerful tool with which to halt any criticism. It is all-pervading and has struck at the heart of our cherished freedom of speech. Those who championed multiculturalism in the early days would openly and quite happily say that in order for it to work, some restrictions on what could and couldn't be said would have to be operated. But what this has meant in practice since then is a massive and ongoing expansion in hate speech laws and the introduction recently of those Orwellian-sounding so-called non-crime hate incidents. The everyday saying, which I heard from being a child upwards, it's a free country, you never hear anymore, and with good reason. And this restriction is about to get worse. The all-party parliamentary group's new definition of Islamophobia, a made-up, nonsensical term anyway, has been adopted by the Labour Party and will, in all likelihood, come into law. What this will do, it will effectively outlaw all criticisms of Islam and introduce what is, in essence, a blasphemy law. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to me, that is the perfect example of how the requirements of multiculturalism undermine the established traditions and values of this nation. So, what of the future as referred to in this motion? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd say it's very bleak. We have in recent years seen increasing sectarian disorder, as witnessed in both Leicester and London. Foreign disputes have effectively been imported and now played out in this land. And last year's general election was a landmark in it saw the first election to Parliament of 5 or 4 sectarian Muslim MPs. But if the disaster which is what I think it is, of multiculturalism is to be thrown into the garbage can of history, as I believe it should be. What should be in its place? Well, the answer that we mostly hear, and we've heard it tonight, is that we need integration. As things stand, this is entirely implausible. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, integration, but it's simply implausible now. It is impossible to integrate up to 1 million new people a year from very, very different cultures into this country. And with established large communities already existing here, there is virtually no need or indeed incentive to integrate. And as we now know, since the mass pro-Palestinian marches after October 7th, there are many people who have no intention of integrating and indeed despise what we are. So I would say two things. Later, sir, I would say two things. One, if we are to have any hope of changing the situation, we have to have a halt to any further mass migration. And number two, what I need, and this is a tall order, what I want to see, what I hope, is that we have an entirely new, a fresh establishment, one that believes in Britain, is not ashamed of Britain, has not got a distaste for nationhood, believes in the glories of Western civilization. That is what we have. Now, I can only hope. But when I look and see what has happened in America the past week, I have some hope. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.